In the winter of war-torn 1942, a ghostly silhouette lay half-buried on a remote Aleutian island, an aircraft every Allied pilot feared. But when American engineers reached the wreck, they discovered something the world never expected. The legendary Japanese Zero had a fatal flaw, one that could change the air war forever. The Pacific Ocean in 1941 was a world of contradictions, an endless sheet of blue stretching beyond imagination, yet hiding storms, reefs, and the ambitions of empires. On its surface drifted merchant ships, island garrisons, and carrier groups, each unaware of the shadow preparing to descend upon them. A shadow shaped not by myth or rumor, but by metal and meticulous engineering, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. When the Zero first appeared in combat, it didn't merely surprise Allied pilots, it stunned them into disbelief. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the A6M was a marvel of extreme lightweight construction. It carried a range of nearly 1,900 miles, more than double many Western fighters. Its climb rate was astonishing, its turning radius impossibly tight. And to those who faced it, the Zero felt less like an aircraft and more like an apparition. The first Allied encounters came in China in 1940, but the alarms were drowned out by global chaos. Only after Pearl Harbor did the wider Pacific learn what the Chinese Air Force had already whispered: there was a plane no one could outfight. In the Philippines, December 1941 turned skies into graveyards. American P-40 Warhawks, rugged but heavy, scrambled against incoming Japanese formations. Fighter pilots like Lieutenant Joseph Joe Moore reported being outturned within seconds. Others watched in shock as Zeros climbed vertically, something most American fighters could attempt only briefly before stalling. At Clark Field, Nichols Field, and Del Carmen, pilots found themselves ambushed by a machine they had never studied, never trained against, and barely even believed existed. Wake Island soon became another page in the growing legend. Marine Fighting Squadron 211, equipped with aging Grumman F-4F Wildcats, defended the remote outpost with tenacity. But even their skill could not blunt the Zero's dominance. Marine pilots reported being hit from angles they didn't think physically possible. Some described the Zero as floating, then striking with sudden violence, rolling, diving, and climbing back upward with impossible elegance. For every Wildcat lost, the Marines were lucky to claim even one Zero in return. Through these early battles, one theme echoed across pilot debriefings: we shoot them. We see holes. And they keep coming. The reason, though unknown at the time, was simple. The Zero's ultralight design included minimal armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft was a tinderbox, but also a feather, able to dance around heavier Allied fighters before they could bring guns to bear. By early 1942, morale across the Pacific front sagged under the weight of repeated defeats. Entire squadrons had been erased in hours. Young pilots, many flying outdated machines, found themselves thrown against an enemy aircraft whose performance bordered on the unbelievable. The phrase whispered in tents, briefing rooms, and makeshift airfields was always the same: how do you fight what you can't catch? How do you kill what you can't hit? Yet beneath the fear lay a deeper problem. Allied intelligence had almost nothing on the Zero. No blueprints. No technical documents. Not a single captured airframe to study. It remained an enigma, a weapon without origin, as though it had simply materialized out of Pacific fog, and then, in the summer of 1942, something changed. High above the Aleutian Islands, where low clouds swallowed mountains and storms claimed ships without hesitation, a lone radio transmission crackled across the static. A Japanese pilot, disoriented by fog and wind, reported engine trouble. The coordinates he gave placed him miles off course, drifting toward an uninhabited stretch of Alaskan wilderness. Moments later came a final burst of static, then silence far below, unseen through the mist. An aircraft spiraled toward the dark, frozen earth. The Pacific's most feared phantom was falling, alone, vulnerable, and lost. And for the Allies, the chase for the impossible was about to take a dramatic turn. July 1942. While the world's eyes fixated on Midway, another battle played out thousands of miles to the north, in a place so remote it felt untouched by war. Akutan Island, one of the wind-carved Aleutians, lay silent beneath a cold sky. Jagged volcanic ridges rose out of the fog, their black slopes broken only by patches of wet tundra and streams that cut through the earth like ancient scars. It was a lonely, hostile landscape, and soon it would cradle one of the most valuable aircraft in the history of the Pacific War. On June 3rd, the Japanese Navy had launched attacks against Dutch Harbor as part of the Aleutian diversion. Among the aviators was Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga, a 19-year-old pilot of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, flying from the carrier Ryujo. Koga had already earned respect among his peers, skilled, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. On this sortie, he flew alongside wingmen Makoto Endo and Tsuguo Shikada, tasked with escorting strike aircraft returning from Dutch Harbor. Their orders were simple: keep the enemy fighters away, maintain formation, and return to base at the limit of their fuel range. But what Koga didn't know was that American anti-aircraft gunners, hastily assembled to defend the naval station at Dutch Harbor, were waiting. The sky echoed with tracer fire as Japanese aircraft swept low over rooftops and fuel tanks. In the chaos, shrapnel shot upward and tore through Koga Zero, severing an oil line. Black smoke trailed behind him, thick, oily, unmistakable. His engine still held power, but the loss of lubricant meant only one thing: the aircraft would seize soon, and violently. Koga broke formation, radioing his intention to make an emergency landing. His wingmen followed, refusing to abandon him. Below them, Akutan Island emerged from the fog, a barren, grassy expanse that Japanese pilots had been told could serve as a makeshift emergency landing field. But the intelligence was dangerously wrong. The flat terrain was actually a deceptive mix of soft, waterlogged tundra and hidden ridges. To the eye from above, it looked safe. To the aircraft touching down, it was fatal. Koga lowered his landing gear. The Zero descended in a controlled glide, engine coughing as oil burned away. Endo and Shikada circled overhead, watching their comrades' final approach. For a moment, it seemed the landing would work. The wheels touched ground, slicing into the wet tundra. But within seconds, the soft earth grabbed the landing gear, locking it in place. The Zero pitched forward violently. Its nose dug into the ground. The tail lifted. And in a heartbeat, the aircraft flipped upside down. The impact crushed the canopy. Koga died instantly, still strapped into his harness. His two wingmen could only circle helplessly. Unable to land or destroy the wreck without risking their own loss, they marked the location and turned back toward Ryujo. The aircraft was left untouched, an eerie, silent monument on a windswept island where no one witnessed the crash and no one came to bury the pilot. And there it remained, for more than a month. Fog wrapped around the wreckage like a shroud. Rain soaked its wings. Gales swept across the tundra, rattling its metal skin. Yet the Zero, its frame remarkably intact despite the flip, endured the elements in near-perfect condition. Then, one day in July, an American PBY Catalina patrol plane scanned Akutan Island during a routine mission. The crew spotted something unnatural, metal glinting in the grey landscape. At first, they assumed it was debris from a US aircraft. But as they circled lower, shapes emerged: curved wingtips, the distinct tail design, and the unmistakable form of a Japanese Zero lying upside down in the grass. Almost impossible. Word traveled quickly. US Navy intelligence officers, long desperate for even a fragment of the elusive fighter, suddenly confronted a possibility beyond their expectations. If the wreck had survived the Aleutian storms, if its engine and control surfaces remained intact, then America might, for the first time in the war, lay hands on a complete Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The race began, not against Japan, but against nature itself. What they would find on Akutan Island had the power to shift the balance of the Pacific Air War. And every passing hour of wind, rain, and decay threatened to erase that opportunity forever. The Aleutian Islands were a battlefield unlike any other in the Pacific. There were no palm trees, no coral lagoons, no blue horizons. Only freezing rain that cut like needles, winds that shifted without warning, and a bleak volcanic landscape that swallowed sound. When the US Navy dispatched a recovery team to Akutan Island in July 1942, they weren't just racing fog and storms, they were racing the decay of a priceless enemy machine. The men came ashore in rubber boats, stepping into mud that sucked at their boots and refused to let go. Their breath fogged instantly in the cold. The tundra rolled unevenly toward jagged black cliffs, and every step felt like walking across a soaked sponge. No one knew what they would find. The report claimed a Japanese fighter, possibly intact, had gone down here. But after a month of Aleutian weather, the odds seemed slim. They pushed through the low fog until someone shouted. Ahead of them, half buried in wet grass and volcanic soil, lay a shape they recognized instantly. The inverted wings. The slender tail. The unmistakable silhouette that had haunted every Allied pilot since Pearl Harbor. The Zero. Not burned. not shattered. Just lying there. For a moment, no one spoke. The aircraft's fuselage, painted the familiar light grey of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was almost undamaged. The propeller had snapped on impact. The canopy was crushed from the flip. But the wings, the engine cowling, the control surfaces, all remarkably intact. One man later recalled, it looked like it had simply fallen asleep. Slowly, the recovery team approached, boots squelching in the mud. They were mechanics, engineers, sailors, men who'd read intelligence briefings describing the Zero as a ghostly killer their own pilots couldn't match. And now, they were standing beside the machine that had shredded formations over the Philippines, outturned wildcats at Wake Island, and humiliated squadrons across the Pacific. Some stared in awe, others in anger. Every man knew someone who hadn't come home because of aircraft like this. But the shock quickly gave way to urgency. The swampy ground made any movement dangerous, the tundra behaved like quicksand, and every attempt to lift the airframe risked tearing it apart. There was no specialized equipment, no pre-built cranes, no manuals on how to salvage a state-of-the-art Japanese fighter flipped upside down in a bog. They would have to improvise. Working in the freezing rain, the team dug channels around the aircraft to free the wings without damaging their structure. They used timber, ropes, and sheer manpower to lift the fuselage inch by inch. The mud resisted, gripping the Zero like a predator refusing to give up its prey. At one point, the tail nearly snapped under its own weight. At another, the wingtip sank deeper, threatening to twist the entire airframe. Every movement was a gamble. Every mistake could destroy what might be the only intact Zero in American hands. Hours turned into days. The recovery crew battled hypothermia, exhaustion, and the constant fear that a sudden Aleutian storm would sweep across the island and ruin everything. Yet piece by piece, they raised the fighter from the tundra and secured it on makeshift sleds. The landing gear, crushed beyond repair, was removed. The shattered canopy was carefully lifted off. The engine was boxed in layers of padding, mud scraped away by hand. They worked until their gloves tore and their fingertips went numb. When the final straps tightened and the wreck was loaded aboard the recovery ship, many stood silently, studying the fragile but unmistakably lethal aircraft one last time. They had touched the metal that countless American pilots had died chasing through the skies. They had held the wings that turned tighter than any Allied fighter. They had lifted the engine that climbed faster, struck harder, and flew farther than anything built in the West. The impossible had been saved. And as the ship pulled away from the desolate coast of Akutan, one officer summed up the weight of what they had accomplished. "If we can get it airborne," he said quietly, watching the battered Zero disappear into the fog, "the Pacific may never be the same." The battered A6M Zero arrived at Naval Air Station North Island under armed guard, loaded onto a flatbed like a fallen predator captured from the wild. Mechanics, engineers, and officers gathered around the strange trophy, their breath held with a mixture of awe and anticipation. For months, Allied pilots had fought this aircraft without blueprint, weakness, or understanding. Now, for the first time in the war, America had an intact Zero, the Zero from Akutan Island. It was rolled into a secure hangar, its paint still streaked with Aleutian mud. Floodlights bathed the fuselage in harsh white, revealing its surprisingly crude construction. Panels seemed thin enough to flex by hand. Rivets were spaced wider than expected. And beneath the wing root, where the ground crew scraped away tundra soil, the metal skin revealed its shocking secret. The supposedly invincible fighter was built lighter than anything American engineers had ever seen. Teams from the Bureau of Aeronautics and the Naval Aircraft Factory arrived within days. Test pilots, including Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders, one of the Navy's most respected aviators, were assigned to evaluate it. The Akutan Zero was no longer a battlefield relic. It was now the most valuable intelligence asset in the Pacific theater. Work began at dawn. Every panel removed. Every cable inspected. Every bolt measured. And the deeper the technicians went, the more unbelievable the truth became. The Zero's legendary agility, its tight turns, its lightning climb rate, was not the result of some exotic Japanese technology. It came from something far simpler and far more dangerous. Weight. Or rather, the absence of it. The aircraft had been engineered with a ruthless focus on lightness. Entire structural elements were pared down to the bare minimum. Control surfaces used the thinnest possible skins. The wings, though elegantly shaped for lift, had minimal reinforcement. Even the fuselage frame was built like a skeleton designed for performance, not survival. As one engineer muttered while tapping the metal with a knuckle, "It's a ballet dancer with the bones of a bird." What stunned the Americans most was what wasn't there. There was no cockpit armor, not a single steel plate protecting the pilot, not in the seat, not in the firewall. Nothing. The fuel tanks were entirely unprotected. No self-sealing membranes, no layered rubber, no insulation. A single incendiary round would turn the aircraft into a torch. The control surfaces, especially the ailerons, proved dangerously fragile at high speeds. They began to stiffen under pressure as airflow increased, making roll control fade dramatically in fast dives. When technicians ran structural stress tests, they discovered another fatal flaw. At high diving speeds, the Zero swings risked catastrophic failure. This meant the aircraft that seemed unstoppable in a dogfight at low altitudes became a stiff, uncontrollable, and potentially fragile machine when forced into steep, high-speed maneuvers. Piece by piece, myth gave way to reality. The invincible Zero was not invincible at all. When Lieutenant CMD Sanders prepared the aircraft for its first test flight in September 1942, he did so with every wartime briefing in mind, warnings of a Japanese fighter that could outperform anything America had. But when the wheels left the ground and the Zero climbed into the California sky under American hands for the first time, the truth finally revealed itself. At low speeds, Sanders experienced the agility Allied pilots had feared, turned so tight they felt unnatural, a responsiveness almost too light. But once he pushed the throttle, dove at higher speeds, and stressed the aircraft's frame, its weaknesses became undeniable. The Zero simply couldn't handle high-velocity combat. Controls stiffened. Maneuverability collapsed. Vulnerabilities emerged everywhere. Over the following weeks, Sanders flew the Akutan Zero 24 times, meticulously documenting its strengths and flaws. His reports were distributed to every combat squadron in the Pacific. Fighter tactics began shifting immediately. Do not engage the Zero in a turning fight. Do not climb with it. Do not dogfight at low speed. Instead, dive, strike, and escape. Use superior speed. Use rugged airframes. Use vertical tactics, not horizontal ones. Suddenly, the Zero was no longer a phantom. It was a machine, brilliant, but compromised. And in the hangars of North Island, as engineers laid out their findings on long drafting tables, one realization echoed through every corner of the base. The Zero didn't need to be matched. It needed to be understood. And once understood, it could be defeated. For the first time since the war began, the balance of the skies was beginning to shift. The restoration of the Akutan Zero had taken weeks of meticulous labor. Its battered wings were straightened, its fuselage reinforced, and its Nakajima Sakai 12 engine coaxed back to life by American mechanics who understood neither the language on its data plates nor the engineering philosophy behind its construction. But now, at Naval Air Station North Island, the moment had arrived. The enemy's most feared fighter would take to the sky, under American control. The men chosen for this task were among the U.S. Navy's most skilled test pilots. Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders, calm and methodical, led the evaluations. These pilots were no strangers to risk, but this flight was different. This was not a familiar Grumman or Lockheed machine. This was a foreign aircraft built for a different doctrine of war, an aircraft that had killed thousands of Allied flyers. Flying it meant embracing every unknown the Japanese Navy had designed into its frame. The Sakai radial coughed as the starter engaged, sputtering once, twice, then roaring to life with a deep, throaty vibration. The propeller blurred, the hangar trembled, and the men standing nearby felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. For the first time on American soil, a Zero's engine was awake, growling like a beast torn from its natural habitat. When Sanders taxied the fighter toward the runway, every mechanic watched with silent intensity. If the aircraft failed, if the repaired landing gear collapsed, if the engine seized, months of work and America's greatest intelligence prize would be lost in seconds. The Zero lifted cleanly. And with that single motion, the Pacific Air War shifted. Once airborne, Sanders pushed the aircraft methodically through its paces. At lower speeds, the Zero handled like a leaf in the wind, light, responsive, dangerously agile. Its ailerons answered the slightest touch, and its climb rate was everything American pilots had feared. But when Sanders pushed the throttle, the magic began to crumble. Above 250 to 275 knots, controls started to stiffen. The aircraft that danced so gracefully at low speed suddenly resisted every attempt to maneuver. In faster dives, the Zero compressed, airflow locking its control surfaces and making rolls sluggish and unpredictable. Sanders noted that as speed built, even moderate banking required brute force. At high velocity, the Zero wasn't a predator. It was a prisoner of its own design. Test after test revealed the same pattern. Speed was its undoing. The Akutan Zero could outturn anything at low altitude, but in a dive, its weaknesses multiplied. The rugged American F-4F Wildcat, initially outclassed, could now exploit its heavier frame to break away with sheer kinetic force. And the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its turbo superchargers and exceptional dive characteristics, could outrun and outclimb the Zero in vertical maneuvers. Sanders' final report was clear and revolutionary. Do not dogfight the Zero horizontally. Do not engage in turn circles. Attack from above, strike once, and dive away. This was the birth of a new doctrine, boom and zoom. American pilots would use altitude as their shield, speed as their sword, and patience as their strategy. The goal was no longer to match the Zero's agility, it was to exploit its fragility. This shift spread rapidly through squadron briefings in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. At Fighter Squadron VF-3, at VF-6, at Marine squadrons fighting over Guadalcanal, the same advice echoed through briefing rooms, sometimes underlined, sometimes shouted. Never turn with a Zero. It became more than a tactic. It became a lifeline. Yet strategy alone couldn't win battles. The next phase would be far more dangerous, teaching hundreds of young pilots, many barely out of flight school, to unlearn everything they had been taught about dogfighting. To trust vertical energy over instinct. To resist the urge to chase an enemy into a turn that guaranteed death. The Akutan Zero had given America the answers. But the question remained. Could frontline pilots adapt quickly enough to survive the battles ahead? The first test of the new doctrine came not in a classroom or a quiet Pacific hangar, but in the furnace of Guadalcanal, where every mistake was paid for in blood. By late 1942, American pilots of the Cactus Air Force were already exhausted. They lived among the mud, malaria, and nightly shelling of Henderson Field. They had watched friends vanish into the ocean or the jungle below. And they knew the deadly reputation of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a fighter that had swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies with almost mythic dominance. But this time, something was different. The pilots climbing into their F-4F Wildcats and P-400 Airacobras carried more than ammunition. They carried the hard-won secrets extracted from a single crash-landed fighter on a remote island, the Akutan Zero. For the first time, Allied aviators understood that the Japanese aircraft had limits, real, exploitable weaknesses buried beneath its extraordinary agility, and on Guadalcanal, they intended to use them. The first engagements were cautious, almost experimental. Pilots avoided turning fights, resisting the instinct to follow the Zero into its deadly horizontal spirals. Instead, Wildcats climbed high, waited, and then dove, using gravity as a weapon. The Zero, so fearsome at low speeds, became unstable above 250 to 275 knots. Its controls stiffened, its roll rate collapsed, and in steep dives it compressed dangerously. The Americans used this to strike like hawks, one slashing pass, guns blazing, then a dive away before the Zeros could counterattack. In one clash over the Solomon Sea, a lone Wildcat pilot, outnumbered 3-1, survived by relying entirely on the new doctrine. He stayed high, refused every baited turn, and used repeated boom and zoom attacks to disrupt his pursuers. The Japanese pilots, frustrated and unable to match his dives, eventually broke off. Encounters like this would have been unthinkable only months earlier. Meanwhile, in the skies of New Guinea, a new breed of Allied fighter entered the fight, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Its twin engines gave it speed the Zero could not hope to match. And when P-38 squadrons adopted the boom and zoom philosophy, they didn't just survive ambushes, they shattered them. In one engagement near Lae, a formation of Zeros descended to trap a group of P-38s stretched out below. Before the Japanese could complete their attack, the Lightnings dove, not to escape, but to build speed. They climbed back up in a sweeping arc and slashed through the Zero formation with devastating velocity. The Zeros tried to follow, and failed. Their engines strained, their controls froze, and the Americans simply outdove them again and again, breaking apart what should have been a perfect ambush. For the first time, casualty ratios began to shift. The Zero remained deadly. Its turning radius was unmatched. Its pilots were some of the most experienced combat aviators in the world, many hardened by hundreds of hours over China and Southeast Asia. Yet now, they found themselves facing enemies who refused to fight on zero terms, enemies who used altitude, teamwork, and discipline to deny the Japanese their greatest advantages. And slowly, painfully, the myth of the invincible Zero began to crack. Reports flowed in from Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and New Guinea. Wildcats escaping fights that used to be traps. P-38s diving away from danger with ease. Allied pilots coming home alive, not because they matched the Zero's agility, but because they finally understood how to exploit its fragility. Japanese aviators, who had spent years dominating the skies uncontested, began to sense an unsettling shift. They saw opponents who no longer panicked, who no longer tried to outturn them, who avoided the Zero's strengths and relentlessly attacked its vulnerabilities. The air battles became harsher, bloodier, more uncertain. Many Japanese pilots, veterans from Shanghai, Nanjing, and the early Pacific offensives, realized the truth before the higher command did. Their secret was out. The Zero was still a formidable machine. But it was no longer a mystery. And in aerial warfare, knowledge was as deadly as any bullet. As 1943 approached, both sides braced for the next phase of the Pacific Air War, one where skill, technology, and tactics would collide in even fiercer skies. The Americans had rewritten the rules. Now the question was simple. Could they learn to master them fast enough to survive what was coming next? By 1943, the skies that once belonged unquestionably to the rising sun began to shift in color. The deep confidence that had carried Japanese aviators from China to Pearl Harbor flickered under the harsh reality of a changing war. The Zero, the symbol of Japan's airborne supremacy, was no longer evolving fast enough to survive what was coming. The problem was not a lack of talent or bravery. Japan's fighter pilots remained among the most disciplined in the world. The issue was deeper, structural, and rooted in decisions made long before the first Zero ever took flight. Japan's aviation industry, already strained in the 1930s, was never built for a prolonged, industrial-scale war. The Zero's original design philosophy, championed by engineer Jiro Horikoshi, prioritized lightness above everything else. By removing armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy structural supports, the A6M achieved astonishing maneuverability and range. In the early war, when opponents flew slower, heavier designs, that gamble paid off brilliantly. But as American factories roared to life, Japan found itself trapped by its own design success. Attempts to upgrade the Zero ran into immediate barriers. The lightly built airframe could not easily accept more armor or larger engines without compromising structural integrity. Japan also lacked the high-octane fuel needed to support significantly more powerful power plants. And the nation faced mounting shortages of strategic materials, especially aluminum, forcing manufacturers to cut corners just to sustain production. Doctrinal rigidity compounded the crisis. The Imperial Japanese Navy's aviation leadership clung tightly to the belief that maneuverability was the defining measure of a superior fighter. They resisted heavier aircraft designs, rejected proposals for more robust protection, and demanded performance characteristics that were no longer realistic in a rapidly modernizing battlefield. Even as American engineers introduced new fighters with unprecedented speed and firepower, Japan struggled to produce meaningful successors to the Zero. Meanwhile, the US was transforming the skies with a generation of aircraft that the Zero simply wasn't built to fight. The F-6F Hellcat entered service in 1943, faster, better protected, heavily armed, and engineered specifically with Zero countermeasures in mind. It could outclimb, outdive, and out-accelerate Japan's aging fighters while absorbing damage that would obliterate a Zero's fragile frame. The F-4U Corsair followed, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine and distinctive gull wings. It delivered blistering speed and lethal firepower, turning dogfights into brief, decisive encounters. Even the North American P-51 Mustang, the rising star of the European theater, began creeping toward the Pacific by late 1943. Its long-range and superb high-altitude performance hinted at a future where Japanese airspace itself would no longer be a sanctuary. For Japan's pilots, the shift was devastating. The veterans who had flown unchallenged over China now found themselves outpaced, outgunned, and increasingly outnumbered. Their training program, once elite, was collapsing under catastrophic attrition. Replacement pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the hours once considered necessary. Many never survived their first engagement. The psychological toll was immense. Letters recovered after the war spoke of pilots confronting not only the enemy but the sobering realization that their aircraft, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was becoming obsolete in real time. The Zero had not changed. But the war had. And as American fighters swept across the islands of the Pacific with growing confidence, one truth became impossible to deny. The skies no longer belonged to Japan. And the final battles, the ones that would decide the fate of entire nations, were approaching fast. In the vast sweep of the Pacific War, with its island jungles, carrier duels, and terrifying distances, few single events reshaped the air war as profoundly as the recovery of one lost fighter on a remote Aleutian island. The Akutan Zero, once a symbol of Japanese invincibility, would become an unlikely turning point, its silent wreckage offering answers to questions that had haunted American pilots since the first hours of Pearl Harbor. When engineers, test pilots, and intelligence officers pieced together its secrets, the consequences rippled across every front line. The first shift came in the air itself. Knowledge gained from the Akutan Zero's performance trials translated into a new generation of U.S. fighter tactics. No more desperate turning matches with a plane designed to outmaneuver almost anything in the sky. Instead, American pilots learned to fight on their own terms, using altitude, speed, discipline, and teamwork. The boom and zoom doctrine spread rapidly through Pacific squadrons. Dive attacks, vertical maneuvers, slashing strikes, and coordinated wing pairs turned the Zero strengths into liabilities. Combat reports soon reflected the transformation. Pilots who had once gone into battle outmatched now returned with confidence, armed with knowledge no training manual had previously been able to provide. But the legacy did not end with tactics. Aircraft designers absorbed the Zero's hard-earned lessons with equal speed. They studied its lightweight construction, understanding both the brilliance and the fragility behind it. They saw how the absence of self-sealing tanks made the Zero deadly in a duel but fatally vulnerable to return fire. They observed how its agility came at the cost of diving strength, structural rigidity, and high-speed control. These insights influenced aircraft already in development and those still on drawing boards. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in mid-1943, embodied this shift. It was engineered with one purpose: dominate the Zero. Reinforced dive performance, heavy armor, 6.50 caliber Brownings, and a powerful engine gave it every advantage the Zero lacked. The Corsair followed with even more raw speed. Together, they arrived not as mere iterations of American engineering, but as direct answers to what had been learned from the captured fighter. Intelligence breakthroughs radiated outward. The Akutan Zero helped decrypt broader patterns in Japanese design philosophy, production capabilities, and doctrinal thinking. Analysts used these discoveries to predict future aircraft limitations and anticipate the tactics Japanese aviators would likely rely on. For the first time since 1941, the US held a comprehensive understanding of its enemy in the sky. And then there was morale, an invisible force that shapes every war. In 1942, the Zero seemed untouchable, almost mythical. Rumors of its supernatural maneuverability and its pilots' near-perfect gunnery haunted American squadrons. But when word spread that one had been captured and flown, its weaknesses exposed and catalogued, something fundamental shifted. The mood in briefing rooms changed. The fear that had loomed over the Pacific Air War began to erode. Pilots no longer saw the Zero as a phantom. They saw it as a machine, dangerous, yes, but beatable. In the end, the Akutan Zero became far more than a downed aircraft. It became a symbol of what wins wars, the relentless search for understanding. Bravery alone was never enough. Victory belonged to those who learned, adapted, engineered, tested, and never stopped studying their adversary. From the Aleutians to the Solomons, from Midway to the Marianas, the lessons drawn from that single aircraft reshaped the Pacific skies. And in a final twist of irony, the Zero, once feared across thousands of miles of open ocean, became the key that unlocked its own downfall.